Hey everyone, I'm Theo. It's been eating at me for a while now. I'm talking about how I walked away from my marriage without saying a word, and honestly, I don't regret it one bit. Let me take you back to where it all started going downhill. My ex-wife Natasha and I were together for 8 years and change. When we first got married, everything felt right. We weren't just two people sharing an apartment. We were building something real together. We had dreams about creating a family, buying a house with a yard, the whole package that people talk about when they say they want to settle down. For the first few years, we were genuinely happy. We laughed together, made plans together, and actually enjoyed each other's company. But then things started shifting around the 5 year mark. And it wasn't one of those dramatic overnight changes. It was subtle, like watching paint fade in the sun. You don't notice it happening until one day you look up and realize the color is completely different. The real trouble began when we decided to start trying for kids. Both of us wanted children desperately. We talked about names, imagined what they'd look like, planned out which room would become the nursery. But month after month, nothing happened. We went to fertility specialists, endured countless appointments, dealt with injections and tests and strict schedules that turned our intimate life into a clinical procedure. Every single month became this cycle of hope followed by crushing disappointment. I watched what it did to Natasha. She started pulling away emotionally, becoming this shell of the person I married. At first, I figured it was just the stress of everything we were going through because I was hurting too. But eventually, she didn't just give up on the fertility treatments. She gave up on everything. She gave up on the dream of having kids. And somewhere in that process, she gave up on us too. The warmth between us evaporated and got replaced with this polite coldness that felt worse than any argument. We still shared the same space, ate meals at the same table, slept in the same bed technically, but it felt like I was living with a complete stranger. The silence between us became suffocating. And what eliminated me was that she didn't even seem to notice or care that we'd become roommates instead of partners. I kept telling myself that real love meant hanging on even when the other person had already let go. So I stayed way longer than I should have. About 14 months before everything completely imploded, Natasha's sister Brielle showed up at our front door with her 2 kids in tow. She'd just gotten out of a toxic relationship with her husband. And I'm talking about the kind of breakup that involves screaming matches, accusations of cheating, and cops showing up multiple times. It was a complete disaster, and obviously she needed somewhere to crash. When Natasha asked if Brielle could stay with us for a few days while she figured out her next move, I didn't hesitate to say yes. It seemed like the right thing to do, especially since her kids didn't deserve to suffer because their parents couldn't get along. So they moved in with a couple of suitcases, and I assumed it would be temporary. But here's the thing about temporary house guests. Sometimes they forget the temporary part. Those few days stretched into a week, then 2 weeks, then a full month. Brielle never talked about finding work or getting her own apartment or even going back to her hometown. She just settled in like she'd signed a lease. Her stuff took over the guest room, and her kids' toys spread through every room like an invasion. Their clothes got mixed into our laundry. The living room became a playground. I kept my mouth shut at first because I understood she was going through a rough time. But then 1 month became 2, then 3, and suddenly I had an entire second family living under my roof, and nobody seemed to think this was a problem except me. Brielle was loud, obnoxious, and always had some sarcastic comment ready. Her kids were completely out of control, no discipline whatsoever, no respect for boundaries or personal space. It was like living in a daycare center run by someone who'd never actually worked with children. Every single day brought new tension. I'd drag myself home from work exhausted, hoping for just a little bit of peace and quiet, only to walk into some fresh chaos. Arguments became our primary form of communication. There were no real conversations anymore, just constant conflict. And the worst part, the part that really twisted the knife, was that Natasha always sided with her sister. Every single time. No matter how unreasonable Brielle acted, no matter how disrespectful she was toward me, Natasha would defend her. I'd try to bring up my concerns calmly and rationally, and she'd shut me down immediately. She'd make excuses like she's my only sister, or you can't seriously expect me to kick her out just because of one little thing you don't like. My feelings didn't matter to Natasha anymore. My frustration wasn't valid in her eyes. There was this one incident that really stuck with me. Brielle was making fun of me right in front of everyone, throwing out these little digs and insults. Instead of telling her sister to knock it off, Natasha actually joined in. She smirked and said, "Oh, come on, stop it. He's just sensitive." Then they both laughed, like it was the funniest thing in the world. I felt humiliated in my own home. Things got so bad that I wasn't even sleeping in my own bedroom anymore. Natasha would let Brielle and her kids take over our bed, and I'd have to find somewhere else to sleep like I was the guest in my own house. I know what you're probably thinking. Why didn't you just leave? Trust me, I asked myself that question constantly. But it wasn't as simple as just walking out the door. I genuinely believed that a lot of what Natasha was going through stemmed from the pain of not being able to have children. That grief had crushed her spirit, and I thought if we could somehow work through it together, maybe we could find our way back to the love we used to share. So I stayed longer than any reasonable person would have, clinging to the hope that our marriage could still be saved. But deep down, I was running out of patience and energy. Eventually, I reached a breaking point where love alone wasn't enough to keep me anchored in a place where I felt invisible and unwanted. I scheduled a quiet meeting with a divorce attorney and laid out everything that had been happening. A few weeks later, the papers were drawn up and ready to go, but I couldn't bring myself to serve them to Natasha. Not because I thought she'd suddenly change, but because some pathetic part of me still wanted her to look at me the way she used to, even if it was just one more time. While I waited and tried to figure out what to do, the tension at home didn't improve at all. I started making preparations in secret. First, I quietly packed up my essential belongings, important documents, clothes, things that had sentimental value, and stored everything in old cardboard boxes. I labeled them vaguely so if anyone stumbled across them, they wouldn't immediately know what I was planning. Then I rented a storage unit on the outskirts of town, paid cash so there wouldn't be any paper trail, the kind of anonymous place where nobody would think to look. I moved the boxes there gradually, just a few at a time, so it wouldn't be obvious. I opened a new bank account under a slightly different name variation. I bought a prepaid phone. I even researched potential cities where I could start over, looking for somewhere smaller and quieter where I could disappear. I planned every detail down to the hour. If my marriage was going to end, I was going to vanish completely. But I still didn't pull the trigger on any of it, because despite everything, despite all the pain and exhaustion and loneliness, I still loved her. Somewhere buried underneath all that hurt was the woman I'd married, and I was still holding on to her memory. One Saturday afternoon, I went out to clear my head for a few hours. When I got back home and pulled into the driveway, there were way more cars than usual parked along the street. I could hear laughter and kids screaming before I even got out of my car. I walked inside and followed the noise to the backyard. What I found was a full-scale family barbecue in progress. Kids were running around with juice boxes. Someone was manning the grill flipping burgers. Music was playing. Drinks were set up on the patio table. Paper plates piled high with food. It looked like a scene from a family reunion commercial. The only problem was that I had absolutely no idea this was happening. Nobody had mentioned it to me. I stood there for a moment, just taking it all in, feeling like I'd walked into someone else's party at my own house. I kept my face neutral and spotted Natasha laughing with her parents near the patio. Before I could say anything, one of her aunts waved me over and asked me to help carry something. I've always gotten along fine with Natasha's extended family. Honestly, better than I got along with Natasha herself lately. So I forced a smile and went to help. As I handed over the tray, another relative leaned in with a curious expression and asked where I'd been all day, saying they'd been there for hours and didn't I know they were coming. That's when it hit me. I'd been deliberately excluded from my own family gathering. Before I could even respond, Brielle's voice cut through the conversation loud enough for everyone to hear. She said, if Theo just disappeared tomorrow, I honestly don't think anyone would even notice. The whole group burst out laughing. Then Brielle added, I didn't even realize you weren't here until just now. Everyone thought it was hilarious. It was supposed to be a joke, I guess, but it didn't feel like one to me. So I raised my hot dog in the air like I was making a toast, gave them a half smile, and then said, challenge accepted. The laughter died down pretty quickly after that. A few people glanced at me, probably assuming I was joking around too. But I wasn't joking at all. That was the exact moment I made my final decision. I was done being invisible, in my own life. By the time the barbecue wound down and most of the guests had left, the house was still buzzing with leftover energy. I'd already been thinking about leaving the marriage for a while, but after what happened that day, I wasn't going to wait around for things to get worse. I didn't need much, just the basics. I grabbed some clothes, my laptop, important documents, and cash, threw it all in a duffel bag, and prepared to walk out. I left a copy of the signed divorce papers right in the middle of the kitchen counter, where Natasha would definitely see them in the morning. I stuck a yellow note on top that said, "You noticed yet?" Then I walked out the door, locked it behind me, got in my car, and drove away. That same night, I deleted every social media account connected to my name. Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, all of it gone. I pulled out the prepaid phone I'd bought, swapped the SIM card, and tossed my original one into a storm drain at a gas station 2 towns over. I didn't want to be found. Not by Natasha, not by anyone. I just couldn't keep destroying myself by staying in that situation. I drove to a small cabin I'd found listed on some obscure classified website. It was owned by a retired guy who didn't ask questions, which was perfect for me. I paid 3 months' rent upfront in cash. The place was deep enough in the woods that it felt like the world had forgotten it existed, but close enough to a small town that I could get groceries when I needed them. I made money doing small freelance work online. Nothing fancy, but it paid enough to cover food, electricity, and the few basic necessities I allowed myself. The days started blending together in the best possible way. There was no schedule, no pressure, no expectations. I'd wake up to birds chirping instead of alarm clocks. Weeks turned into months. My beard grew out and I stopped caring what I looked like. I started eating better, sleeping deeper, and thinking more clearly than I had in years. Not once did I check up on Natasha because I finally realized I didn't need to anymore. That chapter of my life was closed, and nothing good ever comes from reopening a wound just to see if it still bleeds. 8 months after I left, I got the idea to check one of my old email accounts. I was looking for some personal file I'd backed up years ago and hadn't logged into that account since before I disappeared. I wasn't expecting to find anything interesting. The moment the inbox loaded, I froze. There were dozens of emails, all from Natasha. At first, I didn't know what to think. Part of me wanted to just delete them all without reading, and I hovered over that delete button more than once. But eventually, curiosity got the better of me and I started clicking through them. The earliest messages were absolutely furious. She was demanding to know where I'd gone, calling me selfish and cowardly and heartless. She said I was abandoning her, that I had no right to just vanish into thin air. She swore she'd track me down and drag me to court. Her words were sharp and angry, but as I read through the emails chronologically, I noticed the tone shifting. Her words started softening. There were still questions, but they weren't filled with rage anymore. They were uncertain, hesitant, like she was beginning to hear her own voice in the silence I'd left behind. The most recent emails hit differently. I remember staring at one in particular where she said the bank had started sending warnings about missed payments and that foreclosure might be coming. She admitted she was working 2 jobs now, trying to keep the house from going under. She said she'd had to send Brielle and the kids away because they weren't helping with anything. She wrote like she was finally seeing what I'd been trying to explain for years. In one message, she said, "I get it now. I understand why you were so distant. I just wish I hadn't been so blind." Another one read, "I wish you'd come home. Not because I need help, but because I miss you, because I finally understand what you sacrificed trying to hold everything together." Then came the email that really knocked the wind out of me. She wrote, "I was stupid and I took you for granted. I thought you'd always be around no matter how much I ignored you. I still haven't signed the divorce papers. I keep hoping one day you'll walk through the door." I sat there staring at the screen for a long time. I'm not going to lie, I felt something. My chest ached reading those words. I recognized that side of her, the side that could love deeply, the side that had wanted to build a life with me once upon a time. Maybe this was that version of her finally breaking through all the noise and pain. But feelings aren't enough sometimes, and I'd learned that lesson the hard way. For years, I'd stayed in that house, convincing myself that love would fix everything, that time would heal our wounds. But now, even reading those emotional emails, I didn't know if I could ever step back into that life. Too much had happened. Too much damage had been done. It had been exactly 1 year since I vanished, a full year of living off the grid, cutting ties, and breathing freely for the first time in forever. I only went into town once every couple of weeks to pick up supplies. On one of those trips, I stopped by this little coffee shop I'd grown to like. It was tucked away on the edge of town, quiet and unassuming. I walked in, ordered my usual, and was waiting at the pickup counter when I heard someone say my name. At first, I ignored it, figuring I'd misheard. But then, it came again. Firmer this time, more surprised. I turned around and there was Ryan, an old mutual friend from my previous life. His eyes went wide like he'd just seen a ghost, which I guess in a way he had. We exchanged some awkward small talk. I kept it brief and vague, didn't give away any real information about where I was living or what I was doing. Less than a week later, there was a knock on my cabin door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I peeked through the curtain carefully. Standing there on my porch was Natasha. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. Not sure what to do, eventually I opened the door slowly, keeping my expression completely flat. "What do you want?" I asked. She didn't answer with words. She just broke down sobbing right there in front of me. She kept saying she was sorry, that she didn't realize how bad things had gotten, that she wished she'd listened to me and understood sooner. I didn't interrupt her, I just let her speak and get it all out. When she finally finished, I stepped outside with her, looked her straight in the eyes and said, "I'll come back, but only to end this the right way. I'll sign whatever needs to be signed. We'll wrap this up like adults, but I can't be your husband again. Not after everything that happened, not after what your sister put me through, not after you stood by and let it all happen." She didn't argue or try to change my mind. There was no fight left in her, just a slow nod of acceptance. She wiped her face and tried to smile, but couldn't quite manage it, and with that she left. Looking back on everything now, it's strange how people only start to see the value of something or someone when it's already gone. That's one of the hardest lessons life teaches, and unfortunately it's a lesson I had to both give and live through myself. For years I stayed in a marriage that was clearly falling apart, holding on because I thought love would be enough. But what nobody tells you is that love can't survive when only one person is trying, while the other has emotionally checked out. I endured constant disrespect, belittling comments, and the chaos that came with Brielle and her kids taking over my home. I did it all because I loved Natasha, but in the process, I became invisible in my own life. The crazy thing is that it all only started making sense to her after I disappeared. That's when she finally realized what I'd been trying to communicate all along. Maybe that's what some people need, the absence of what they always assumed would stay. So if you're reading this and you're in a situation where you feel like your presence is being taken for granted, I hope my story gives you something to think about. Don't wait until you're completely broken just to prove that you were whole. And if you're someone who's been pushing someone away, ask yourself why it takes their absence for you to finally see their worth. I'd really love to hear your thoughts on all this. Drop a comment below and share your own experience if you've been through something similar. Or even if you haven't, tell me what you think. And if you know someone who might need to hear this kind of story today, please share it with them. You never know who's sitting quietly with their bags already packed, just waiting for one more reason to disappear. Thanks for reading. Update. Since a lot of people have been asking what happened after Natasha showed up at my cabin, I figured I should add this. After she left that day, I gave myself a few days to think everything through. I wasn't making any decisions based on emotion anymore. I'd spent too many years doing that, and it had gotten me nowhere. So I approached it logically. I drove back to the house about a week later. Walking through that front door felt surreal, like stepping into a museum of my old life. Everything looked the same, but felt completely different. Natasha was there, and she'd clearly been preparing for my arrival. The house was clean, quieter than I'd ever seen it. Brielle and her kids were long gone, and you could feel the absence of that chaos immediately. We sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten countless silent dinners, and we talked, really talked, for the first time in years. She didn't make excuses or try to minimize what had happened. She owned all of it. She admitted that she'd let her grief over not having children consume her to the point where she'd stopped being a partner to me. She acknowledged that letting Brielle move in and take over our lives was wrong, and that she should have set boundaries from the beginning. She said she understood now why I'd felt invisible, why I'd reached a point where leaving was the only option left. Hearing her say all of that out loud was validating in a way I hadn't expected. For years, I'd been trying to get her to understand these things, and she dismissed me every time. Now she was finally hearing me, but it was too late. The damage was done. I told her I appreciated her honesty and that I was glad she'd finally come to these realizations, but that it didn't change my decision. We spent the next few hours going through the practical stuff. We divided up our belongings, discussed what would happen with the house, went over the financial details. It was all very civil and mature, which felt strange given how ugly things had been before I left. She asked me one more time if there was any chance I'd reconsider, if we could try therapy or counseling, if we could start over. I looked at her and said no. I explained that I'd spent too long trying to save something that only I wanted to save. I'd given everything I had to that marriage, and I had nothing left to give. I needed to focus on rebuilding myself, not rebuilding us. She cried, but she didn't argue. I think she knew I was right. We signed the divorce papers together that afternoon. It was oddly peaceful, sitting there at that table, putting our signatures on documents that would legally end our marriage. There was sadness, sure, but there was also relief. Relief that we were finally being honest with each other. Relief that I was finally free. Before I left, she asked if we could stay in touch, maybe be friends eventually. I told her maybe someday, but not now. I needed space and distance to fully move on. She understood. I walked out of that house for the second and final time, got in my car, and drove back to my cabin. This time there was no anger, no bitterness, just acceptance. I'd closed that chapter of my life properly. And now I could move forward without any loose ends hanging over me. In the months that followed, I started building a new life for myself. I took on more freelance work and eventually landed a steady remote position that paid well. I made a few friends in the small town near my cabin, people who knew me as Theo, the quiet guy who lived in the woods, not Theo, the guy who disappeared from his marriage. I started hiking regularly, exploring trails I'd never known existed, watching sunrises from mountain peaks, and feeling genuinely alive for the first time in years. I picked up photography as a hobby, capturing the beauty of the natural world around me, finding art in things I'd never noticed before. I generally just enjoyed the peace and simplicity of my new life, the kind of peace that comes from not having to walk on eggshells in your own home. I won't pretend it was always easy or that I adjusted overnight. There were nights when I felt lonely, when the silence of the cabin felt oppressive instead of peaceful, when I questioned whether I'd made the right choice by walking away. There were moments when I missed the good parts of my marriage, the early years when Natasha and I were actually happy together, when we'd stay up late talking about our dreams, when we'd laugh until our stomachs hurt over stupid inside jokes. Those memories would hit me out of nowhere, usually when I was doing something mundane like making coffee or reading a book. But those moments passed, and each time they did, I felt a little bit stronger, a little more certain that I'd made the right decision. About 6 months after we finalized the divorce, I got an email from Natasha. It wasn't long or dramatic, just a simple update on her life. She wanted to let me know that she'd sold the house, the one we'd bought together with so many hopes and dreams, and moved to a different state for a fresh start. She said she'd started seeing a therapist to work through her issues, really digging into the grief and pain she'd been avoiding for years, and that she was doing better. She'd reconnected with some old friends, started a new job that she actually enjoyed, and was slowly rebuilding her life. She thanked me for coming back to end things properly instead of just leaving her hanging with unanswered questions and unresolved feelings. She said she hoped I was happy, wherever I was and whatever I was doing, and that she was genuinely sorry for everything she'd put me through. I wrote back a brief response wishing her well and meaning it sincerely. I genuinely hoped she'd find peace and happiness, just not with me. Not in a way that required me to sacrifice my own well-being again. That was the last time we communicated, and I was okay with that closure. Sometimes I think about what my life would look like if I'd stayed, if I'd kept trying to make that marriage work despite all the signs telling me it was over. I imagine I'd still be in that house, still feeling invisible and unappreciated, still sacrificing my own happiness and mental health for someone who couldn't see my worth, no matter how much I gave. I picture myself growing more bitter and resentful with each passing year, losing more of myself until there was nothing left but an empty shell going through the motions. The thought makes me grateful for the choice I made, even though it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Even though there were moments when I doubted myself and wondered if I was being too harsh or too unforgiving. Walking away from someone you love isn't easy, especially when you've invested years of your life into building something with them. When you've shared dreams and plans and intimate moments that felt like they meant something permanent. But sometimes walking away is the only way to save yourself from drowning in a relationship that's pulling you under. Sometimes love isn't enough, and that's a painful truth that took me a long time to accept. A truth that goes against everything we're taught about relationships and commitment, and never giving up on the people we care about. I learned that you can't make someone value you, no matter how hard you try or how much you sacrifice. You can't force someone to see your worth or appreciate your efforts or recognize the ways you're holding things together. All you can do is recognize when you're not being treated the way you deserve, when your needs are being consistently ignored, when your presence is being taken for granted, and have the courage to remove yourself from that situation before it destroys you completely. I also learned that disappearing the way I did, while dramatic, was necessary for me. It gave me the clean break I needed to start healing. If I tried to leave in a conventional way, with discussions and negotiations and gradual separation, I would have gotten sucked back in. Natasha would have made promises to change, and I would have believed her because I wanted to believe her. We would have fallen back into the same patterns, and nothing would have actually improved. By vanishing completely, I forced both of us to confront the reality of our situation without the possibility of falling back on old habits. These days, I'm in a much better place mentally and emotionally than I've been in years. I've learned to enjoy my own company without feeling like there's something wrong with me for being alone. I've learned to prioritize my own needs without feeling guilty about it, without hearing that voice in my head telling me I'm being selfish. I've learned that being alone is infinitely better than being with someone who makes you feel alone, that solitude chosen freely is completely different from loneliness experienced in a crowded room. I've learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from a situation that's destroying you piece by piece, even if it means walking away from someone you love, even if it means disappointing people who think you should try harder or stick it out longer. If there's one thing I want people to take away from my story, it's this. Your presence in someone's life is a gift, not a guarantee or an obligation. If someone is treating that gift like it's worthless, like it's something they can toss aside or ignore whenever they feel like it, you have every right to take it back. You don't owe anyone your suffering or your pain. You don't owe anyone your silence when they're treating you poorly. You don't owe anyone your continued presence in their life if they're not valuing it, if they're not reciprocating the effort you're putting in, if they're not treating you with basic respect and consideration. I spent years making myself smaller, quieter, less demanding, hoping that if I just asked for less and expected less, Natasha would finally see me and appreciate what I was doing for her and for our marriage. But that's not how it works in reality. Making yourself smaller doesn't make someone value you more or treat you better. It just teaches them that they can treat you poorly without facing any consequences, that they can ignore your needs and dismiss your feelings, and you'll still be there waiting for them. The barbecue incident was my wake-up call, the moment when I realized that I'd become so invisible in my own life that people could joke about my disappearance without even realizing how close to the truth they were, how much that joke reflected the actual reality of my situation. That joke wasn't funny to me because it wasn't really a joke at all. It was an observation, an accurate assessment of how little my presence mattered to the people around me, how easily I could vanish without disrupting anyone's life. And instead of getting angry or defensive or trying to prove them wrong, I decided to prove them right in the most literal way possible. I disappeared, and you know what? They did notice, eventually. But by then I was already gone, already healing, already building a new life where I mattered, where my presence was valued, where I didn't have to fight for basic respect and consideration. Looking back now with the clarity that distance and time provide, I can see that my marriage to Natasha was over long before I actually left, probably years before that final barbecue. We'd been going through the motions for so long, pretending we were still a couple, when really, we were just two people sharing space and going through the routines of married life without any of the actual connection. The fertility struggles broke something fundamental in both of us, but especially in her. She retreated so far into herself that there was no reaching her anymore, no way to bridge the gap that had opened up between us. And instead of dealing with that pain together, instead of turning to each other for support the way couples are supposed to, we let it drive us apart until we were strangers living under the same roof. I don't blame her for grieving the loss of the children we'd never have. I don't blame her for struggling with the reality that our dreams of becoming parents might never come true. That's a legitimate loss, a real grief, and everyone processes that kind of pain differently. But I do hold her accountable for how she treated me during that time, for the choices she made about how to handle her grief. I was grieving too, I was hurting too, I'd lost the same dream she had. But instead of turning to each other for support and comfort, instead of facing that pain as a team, She shut me out completely and turned to her sister, who brought nothing but chaos and disrespect and dysfunction into our home. The fact that Natasha allowed Brielle to disrespect me repeatedly, that she joined in on the jokes at my expense, that she prioritized her sister's comfort over my basic dignity, those were choices she made, and those choices showed me exactly where I stood in her list of priorities. I wasn't even on the list. So yeah, I left. I planned it carefully, executed it perfectly, and I don't regret it. Some people might think I should have tried harder, should have pushed for counseling, should have given her more chances. But those people weren't living my life. They weren't the ones coming home every day to a house full of chaos and disrespect. They weren't the ones sleeping on the couch in their own home because their wife gave their bed to someone else. They weren't the ones being mocked at family gatherings while their spouse laughed along. I gave that marriage everything I had. I stayed long past the point when most people would have left. I tried to be understanding and patient and supportive, and in return, I got treated like I was invisible. So I made myself invisible for real, and it was the best decision I ever made. Now I'm living a life that's mine, on my terms, without constantly sacrificing my happiness for someone who couldn't even see me. I wake up when I want, work on projects I care about, spend time in nature, and generally just exist without the constant weight of someone else's expectations and disappointments crushing me. It's peaceful in a way I'd forgotten was possible. And yeah, Natasha eventually figured out what she'd lost. She eventually realized that I'd been holding things together while she was falling apart. She eventually understood that her sister was toxic and that she should have protected me instead of enabling the disrespect. But that realization came too late. You can't unring a bell. You can't unsay words. You can't undo years of neglect and disrespect with a few apologetic emails. I'm glad she learned and grew from the experience. I'm glad she's working on herself and trying to be better. But that growth doesn't obligate me to give her another chance. That's something I think people struggle to understand. Just because someone apologizes and changes doesn't mean you have to take them back. Sometimes the damage is too deep. Sometimes you've moved on too far. Sometimes you've built a new life that doesn't have room for the person who hurt you, even if they're sorry about it. Forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. I can forgive Natasha for how she treated me while still maintaining the boundary that we're not going to be together. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. So that's my story. That's how I went from being a guy trapped in a dying marriage to a guy living peacefully in a cabin in the woods. That's how I learned that sometimes the most radical act of self-love is simply removing yourself from a situation that's eliminating you slowly. That's how I discovered that being alone is infinitely better than being with someone who makes you feel worthless. If you're in a similar situation, if you're feeling invisible in your own life, if you're constantly sacrificing your happiness for someone who doesn't appreciate it, please hear me when I say this. You deserve better. You deserve to be seen, valued, and respected. You deserve to be with someone who treats your presence like the gift it is. And if the person you're with can't do that, then maybe it's time to consider whether staying is really worth it. Don't wait until you're completely broken. Don't wait until you've lost yourself entirely. Don't wait for one more humiliation, one more dismissal, one more moment of being treated like you don't matter. Start making your plans. Start protecting yourself. Start prioritizing your own well-being. And when you're ready, have the courage to walk away. It won't be easy. It'll probably be one of the hardest things you ever do. But I promise you, on the other side of that decision is a version of yourself that you've forgotten existed. A version that's whole and happy and free. A version that remembers what it feels like to matter. That version is waiting for you. You just have to be brave enough to go find it. Thanks for listening to my story. I hope it helps someone out there who needs to hear it.